spending into next year. Let me yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Congresswoman Delbene, a champion of the child tax credit.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement. This deal will protect American families and our economy from a devastating default on our nation's bills in just 5 days. It will also shield our veterans, seniors, law enforcement, and schools from the worst of the extreme demands my Republican colleagues issued while holding our economy hostage. This deal is far from perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good when the stakes are this high. A default would mean an immediate recession, millions of jobs lost, devastating retirement accounts, and higher borrowing costs for Americans. Compromise means that no one gets everything they want. So we have a choice between a catastrophic outcome or a chance to move forward with a bipartisan compromise. The worst outcome here would be a default. So let's get this done and over to the Senate so we can take default off the table. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malliotakis.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Rolling Stones said, you can't always get what you want, you get what you need. And we need to avert a default that would stop checks to our seniors, benefits for our veterans, hurt the U.S. dollar, and Americans' retirement savings. We also need to change the fiscal trajectory of our nation, and this bill does both by reducing inflationary spending for the first time in over a decade with the largest savings in history, imposing spending caps and adding checks and balances on the executive branch. We started from a place where the President and the Senate refused to negotiate, and we ended with conservative wins that include stopping Biden's plan to hire additional IRS agents this year, clawing back unused COVID funds, expanding work requirements to reduce dependency on public benefits, and cutting costly red tape that slows down critical infrastructure projects. While no deal is perfect, this is only the beginning, and we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Republicans under the leadership of Speaker McCarthy have restored balance to government. We've put an end to the Democrats' massive inflationary spending sprees, and we will continue to fight for the American taxpayers as we proceed in this process to stop reckless policies that fuel inflation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
The House will come to order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for order.
Will members take their conversations off the floor? The House will come to order. Thank you. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A very capable woman, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, is the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Congresswoman Moore, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Republicans claim that they just had to threaten the economic well-being of every American man, woman, and child because of the $31 trillion debt was too high. Well, hypocrisy thou hast to name, GOP, because what they insisted on, their red line, was not financial at all. It was to double down on the so-called work requirements. Thank God the White House negotiations pushed back on the worst of these changes in TANF that would have saved $6 million over 10 years. No, speaker after speaker has insisted on denying food to poor, old women who are primarily black and brown. It seems like the pound of flesh that you get is more delicious than having savings. But just wait. Before the ink is dry on this bill, you will be pushing for $3.5 trillion in business tax cuts. Watch my word. You heard it here first. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman very much. Mr. Speaker, while the Fiscal Responsibility Act is not perfect, and God knows we need serious corrections, but there are at least 10 conservative American provisions in this bill that will benefit our economy and advance a higher level of fiscal responsibility. And let's be honest, this is the most conservative bill that can pass with a Biden White House and a Schumer Senate. The Fiscal Responsibility Act stops the excessive spending, stops the bleeding, and adds to our workforce with work requirements. It includes the most important federal environmental permitting reforms in 40 years. And don't take my word for it. This is coming from the Associated General Contractors of America, the Petroleum Institute, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Virtually every small business association, every group committed to sound fiscal policy, such as Americans for Tax Reform and Americans for Prosperity, have endorsed this legislation. This bill reins in the Biden administration's executive order spending, which accounted for over $1 trillion in spending over the last 2 years. There's also a reduction of the IRS of $20 billion, protect Social Security, and all the while we will avoid a catastrophic default. I urge support of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Congressman Kildee, whose voice and health have been returned.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend, the ranking member, for that. Look, paying America's bills isn't an option. Defaulting on our debt would have a consequence for every single American and, in fact, would have global consequences. It would increase every family's costs, eliminate millions of jobs, threaten the retirement security of seniors and families all across this country. Let me be clear. We shouldn't be in this position. We shouldn't be close to default. It's a manufactured crisis. The House Republican majority created this crisis because they didn't have the will to submit their ideas to the legislative process, rather holding us all hostage to exact this price, to exact this legislation, when we could have simply gone through the legislative process of making decisions about the priorities for this country. They have the majority on the Appropriations Committee, on the Ways and Means Committee, on the Budget Committee. They ought not fear the argument over these issues. We need to make sure that we accept the fact that we've come to a compromise that protects Medicare, Medicaid, protects the American people from catastrophic default. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time in my 15 years in Congress that I've voted to increase the debt limit. I do so today because this measure places real constraints on future spending, more than $2 trillion. That makes this bill the most important victory for fiscal conservatism in more than a decade. The debt is but a symptom of the central problem: reckless spending. Once we've spent $1, there are only 3 ways to pay for it: taxes, inflation, or debt. It's the spending stupid. We've got a long way to go. But until the American people have had enough and replaced the President and the Senate majority, this is a remarkable step forward. And the many pro-growth provisions in the bill provide the most potent antidote to debt: economic expansion. Defeating this bill would create a financial and political panic that will quickly forfeit the many hard-won reforms that are in this bill. We cannot let that happen.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Virginia, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Beyer.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this imperfect bill. Look, I would much rather have voted for a clean debt limit increase, as we did 3 times under the previous president. And I do believe it's profoundly wrong. The Republicans chose to hold our economy hostage, using the American people as leverage to demand concessions, and it was unnecessary. We're in a divided House. They have all the leverage they need to negotiate this through the regular appropriations process. You know, our values sometimes overlap, but they don't here when they want to protect the wealthiest tax cheats, and we just want everyone to pay their fair share. Look, President Biden and his negotiating team worked skillfully and successfully to prevent a majority of the draconian tax cuts. This bill could have been so much worse, but it would be a catastrophe if we didn't pass it. I will vote yes, and I continue to urge my colleagues to permanently abolish the debt ceiling, which could cause a real disaster someday soon if we don't get rid of it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts
Continue to
reserves.
reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to voice my support for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. As I have said from the very beginning, we must negotiate, we must cut spending, and we cannot default. The FRA reduces discretionary spending for the first time in decades and is the largest deficit reduction in our nation's history. It cuts non-defense and non-veteran spending to below 2022 levels, one of the primary goals of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. It saves taxpayers $2.1 trillion over the next 6 years while blocking $5 trillion in new taxes proposed by the Biden administration. The bill also caps spending at 1% growth over the next 6 years. And through the appropriations process, House Republicans will have the opportunity to reduce spending even more. That will help us take on the Biden administration's reckless spending head on, crack down on record inflation, and get our economy on the right track. This bill also protects Social Security, Medicare, and veterans' benefits, despite previous false claims by my Democratic colleagues that we were going to cut those vital programs. It enacts critical permitting and NEPA reform, enacts safeguards on executive spending, and forces Congress to engage in a functional appropriations process. The bottom line is this: with a divided government, no party is going to get 100% of what it wants. We all have a responsibility to govern, and default is not an option. The Fiscal Responsibility Act puts us on the path to fiscal sanity, protects our commitments to veterans and seniors, and raises the debt ceiling so we will not
time
default.
has expired.
That's a bill we should all support, and I will vote aye.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Congressman Evans.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is far from perfect. However, the full faith and credit of the United States is at risk, and we cannot let Republicans drive us to default. Defaulting on the national debt would disrupt Social Security benefits for 92,000 households in my congressional district. I will not stand by and let harm come to our nation, seniors and people disabled. I urge my colleagues not to draw out this debt crisis and instead return to our focus of lowering the cost for working families. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
I'm sorry?
I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a breakdown of the time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 10 minutes. The gentleman from Missouri has 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to another very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
For how much time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement and President Biden's work to ensure the nation pays our bills and avoids catastrophic, self-inflicted economic crisis. This legislation protects the many bipartisan achievements realized in the last Congress, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and PACT Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act with its historic investments in addressing climate change. With this vote, we will protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and prevent devastating cuts sought to life-sustaining SNAP and TANF programs. With this vote, we will keep America moving forward to meet the challenges ahead of us. Compromise requires give and take, and both sides make difficult concessions to achieve this agreement. This is the result of bipartisan deal-making, and I look forward to holding up the President's side of this bargain. I hope this is a learning moment and we can avoid future political brinksmanship. I urge all my colleagues to put the American people over politics and support this important bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts
Thank
is
you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute again to a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from California, Congressman Panetta, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the bipartisan budget agreement to raise the debt ceiling. Because if we don't, we will devastate the global markets and undermine the faith of the world's most important financial system, the United States of America. I support a clean raising of the debt ceiling, but elections have consequences. And my colleagues on the other side wanted to use their leverage for concessions. And so, in a divided government, governing means compromise, and it gets us this bill. Legislation that would, would raise the debt ceiling until 2025. 2, the bill would stop the drastic cuts desired by the Republicans, and it would protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And although it limits SNAP for certain ages, it expands those types of benefits for veterans and our homeless. And finally, we protect the historic legislation that we passed last Congress to invest in our infrastructure, our manufacturing, reduce our drug costs, and care for veterans. And part of this bill even furthers our transition to clean energy. So I will vote for this bill, but we have a lot more to do if we want to get serious about reducing our debt and deficit. But that only begins when we stop governing by crisis and start governing by leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts continues reserved. Gentleman from Missouri.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of my district, most important energy district in the country, and on behalf of American energy independence, and on behalf of all Americans who are searching for a reasonable solution to a looming crisis. There are approximately right now 229 major fossil fuel projects in the United States currently awaiting permit approval. A recent study found that $157 billion in energy investment was stuck in the NEPA pipeline, and that simply a 2-year NEPA deadline would spur $67 billion in energy investment. Killing energy projects by the bureaucratic red tape nightmare and the slow walking that we've seen is unacceptable. No more. I'm extremely proud of the energy reforms, the NEPA reforms, the EPA reforms in this bill, the first in over 40 years, which will speed up over 200 projects to lower costs for consumers and protect our national security. No, this bill is not perfect, and arguably it shouldn't be. A divided government yields compromise, and it slows the heavy hand of government. But saving $2 trillion, lifting families out of poverty, and defunding IRS agents is worth it. Vote yes for America's energy independence.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, an alum of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Plaskett.
Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through Democrats' leadership, Democrats have protected our hard-earned and historic economic recovery. That team secured an agreement that prevents Republicans from forcing devastating default and rejects their most extreme cuts in the GOP Default in America bill. President Biden's agreement protected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' health care. This was a negotiation with individuals whose prime priority was cutting food assistance and protecting the wealthy, and that was their main priority across the entire negotiation. Fiscal responsibility, their only responsibility was to protect their tax cuts for ultra-wealthy that grew the debt to $7 trillion in the first place. The president successfully insisted that this agreement was going to include time limits on SNAP. It needed to include meaningful improvements to SNAP. Republicans protected the wealthy at the feet of the neediest Americans.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Democrats understand the needs of the American people and our most vulnerable Americans, as well as the full faith and credit of the American people.
Gentlelady's no longer recognized. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleagues that because of the Republican Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the bottom 20% of earners saw their average federal tax rate fall to its lowest level in 40 years. Low and middle income families of 4 saved at least $2,000 on their tax bill each year. I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri continues reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member on the Agricultural Committee, Mr. Scott, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Recognized.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most historic night.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman needs to be heard.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, I want to thank President Biden. President Biden invited me, along with the other leaders, ranking member and chairman of our Agriculture Committee. And it gave me a chance to talk straight to the president about the serious food shortage that's coming to our veterans. Right now, when I told him, and many of you may not know this, but the veterans are living in more insecure food households than anybody else, a 7.4% higher than the general public. And when I told President Biden that, he said, we got to do something about it. And that's when he moved with his energy to be able to take not only the veterans, but SNAP and others off of SNAP work requirements.
Gentleman's time
God
expired.
bless this president for his leadership.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair will remind members that they need to remove their conversations from the floor. The speakers deserve to be heard. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervyn, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ran for Congress to solve problems, and this legislation averts a crisis. A default would jeopardize millions of people with unemployment, increase credit ratings, or increase interest rates, and risk retirees and devastate their 401ks. A default would also jeopardize numerous investments in the American worker in the 117th Congress, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bill not only increased created jobs, but it also, with a strong Buy American provision, strengthened our domestic steel and manufacturing base, and it also allows for our members, our veterans, to be protected and puts funds dedicated to the health benefits and provides resources for the Toxic Exposure Fund. I appreciate the dedicated work of the administration and the Democratic colleagues. For my neighbor Gretchen, who had anxiety about her 401k, this bill supports the American worker. It supports the American industry, the steel industry, and it also
Gentleman's time's expired.
Protects the American dream. I'm voting yes.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts
Mr. Speaker,
is
could I
recognized.
inquire as to how much time?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 5 minutes remaining.
Okay.
Gentleman from Missouri has 2.5 minutes.
We're waiting on one speaker, and I'd like to move this along, depending on what the chairman's position is.
Prepared to close. We're prepared to close.
You're prepared to close?
Yes.
We're prepared to close.
This gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for closing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that this has been an elevating conversation about how we arrived here tonight. Our colleagues on the other side, they voted for the infrastructure bill, they voted for the CHIPS Act, they voted for the CARES Act, they voted for the defense spending increases, and they voted for a tax cut in 2017 that borrowed $2.3 trillion that was added to the national debt. Now, for those who might be paying attention tonight, the national debt is the cumulative effect of deficits. These were annual deficits that were run up. Neither party is responsible for the pandemic. On March 11th of 2020, we were warned what was coming. 20 million jobs evaporated. Tonight, in some measure because of the leadership of Joe Biden, every one of those jobs has been returned, and 9.5 million jobs go unanswered. In this negotiation, which means you don't get everything you want, there are some quality moments that we take great credit for. We defended Social Security, despite the fact there were 3 Republican senators who proposed cuts to Social Security. That's the reality. We defended Medicare. We defended Medicaid, and we defended veterans' benefits. And very proud of the fact that we wrote the Pandemic Relief Act. There's a group here tonight, I've been here long enough to know this, they were against this before they were against it. They were against it years ago. Never mind tonight. But this moment of bringing the nation to default, what this does, or what it would do to the American dollar as the currency of choice for the world, what this would do in treasury markets for liquidity purposes, what this would do to the hard-earned 401k plans of the American family, to take us to this moment in this showdown that we had. This argument tonight was never about perfection. All 435 members of this House would probably have written a different version of this bill. But in divided government, that's not reality. Now, the last point I want to make is this. In coming days after this righteous debate about balancing the budget, our Republican colleagues are about to offer a massive tax cut. We need to be ready because of the fiscal rectitude that they have offered on this floor tonight. So the corresponding responsibility of all of us is to point out what they intend to do with another tax cut. 201, $1.3 trillion. And by the way, with 2 wars and 2 million more veterans that we need to support. Now, the other reality is back in 2003, another $1 trillion of tax cuts. And the worst one of all, that tax cut in December of 2017, where they borrowed $2.3 trillion for a tax cut that went to the wealthiest among us and had very meager economic growth. So this debate tonight was a good and spirited one because we also have, I think, found a common purpose in passing this legislation. But let's engage this debate going forward. If we want the things that we say they want, we're going to have to pay for them. And that means at some point revisiting these tax cuts that have been put on the table in an arbitrary fashion, and as I noted, with borrowed money. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
You know, Mr. Speaker, we hear the other side of the aisle over and over talk about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Well, let me tell you about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Last year, we had record revenue into the United States of $4.9 trillion, which was $900 billion plus more than what Joint Tax and CBO predicted what would happen upon passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act delivered for a family of 4 who makes less than $60,000 a year that they pay 0 in federal taxes.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the floor. The gentleman deserves to be heard. The gentleman's recognized.
But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about tax cuts. The other side passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it was tax cuts for their wealthy donors. In fact, the CBO just came out with a new score saying that it cost over $700 billion. But guess what? 90% of your tax credits go to corporations with more than $1 billion in revenues. And it goes to $125 billion to China. That is what your tax cuts did. After years of Washington running in the wrong direction, we have an opportunity to take meaningful steps in the right direction on addressing America's debt crisis. The American people deserve nothing less. They see what inflation caused by reckless spending of the Democrat Party has done to their family budgets, to their retirement security, and to their small business plans. We have the opportunity to end the constant doling out of tax dollars under the guise of COVID relief. We have the opportunity to downsize the $80 billion pay raise that was given to the IRS last year. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. We have the opportunity to support those who can work, to find work and climb out of poverty. We have the opportunity to put some guardrails on the administration so if they are going to spend tax dollars by executive fiat, they have to find savings somewhere else. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to address our debt crisis as we address the debt ceiling. Yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri yields back his balance of his time. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 456. The previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. Question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Provide for a responsible increase to the debt ceiling.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Aye. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Without objection. Purpose is the gentleman from Massachusetts asked for a recorded vote. Those in favor of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on passage of the bill will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797. This is a 15-minute vote. yeas are 314. The nays are 117. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 2797, a bill to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to require certification examinations for accredited investors and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. Vote the yeas are 383, the nays are 18. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, sir. I write to inform you that I am resigning my position as the member of the United States Congress representing the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island, effective at the close of the legislative day of May 31st, 2023. It has been the honor of my lifetime to represent the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island in the United States House of Representatives, and I am eternally grateful for their trust and faith that the people of the 1st District placed in me to serve as their member of Congress for the past 12 years. Enclosed, find a copy of the letter I have submitted to the Rhode Island Governor, Daniel J. McKee. Signed sincerely, David N. Cicilline, Member of Congress.
Pursuant to Section 3Z of the House Resolution 5, the House stands in adjournment until 11 a.m. tomorrow.